You are listening to Reduce the Stigma, CJ106 docu-series funded by the Community Radio Fund of Canada. This series aims to provide information on local services, bring to light the work of healthcare professionals, and most importantly, reduce the discrimination faced by people with direct lived experience with a mental illness.
Hello, my name is Jan Eck, and this is Reduce the Stigma. We hope that you find this series on mental health resources in the Westman region both informative and helpful. We are glad to be bringing to light many issues of mental health and wellness, a topic that in the past had long been discussed in hushed tones, suspicious whispers. Today, it seems we are in a new era of openness about mental health. We want to talk about it because it is something that affects all of us. The more we can talk about it, the more we can destigmatize what we previously held as fearful, unknown, or as something that other people went through. For a mental illness sufferer, talking about it might mean that some people are listening. It could mean that their concerns are being taken seriously, but it definitely means that they are not alone. Chances are you or someone you closely know currently lives with a mental illness. Yet, despite an explosion of information in popular culture surrounding mental health and well-being, stigma remains a barrier to community acceptance, diagnosis, and treatment. By promoting resources that can help people, by discussing the nature of mental well-being in an individual and within society, and by listening to the stories of people living directly with mental illness, we hope to demystify the experience and reduce the stigma against those suffering from real medical conditions. In this episode, we will look generally at the sensitive topic of suicide and more specifically at the work of crisis hotlines, suicide prevention outreach, and suicide bereavement counseling. While not a mental illness itself, but a result of an action induced by suicidal thoughts, the exact causes of suicide remain subjective to the individual. However, research shows that mental illness is the most important risk factor. Almost all suicides have an underlying mood disorder such as depression or a bipolar condition. And because mood disorders are treatable, it is vital that one can access resources they need to help themselves. Unfortunately for many people, a crisis situation can occur where the person has no resources or support network to guide them through a rough time. Withdrawal or self-isolation is common in depression, and a depressive state can leave one feeling utterly hopeless and confused, unable to see or figure out how to access the help that they need. Suicide prevention hotlines, crisis counselors, and emergency mobile units exist to help people in these times of personal chaos or immense uncertainty. Our feature interview this episode will examine the crisis intervention work of Clinic Community Health Center. Believing that everyone has the right to quality care, support, and respect, Clinic Community Health was created in Winnipeg in 1971 with a strong commitment to social justice values. Medical students and volunteer physicians saw a street-level need for non-judgmental medical services among young and marginalized people reluctant to use the general healthcare system. And though Clinic has grown to achieve mainstream recognition for their community health initiatives, these values remain at the core of Clinic operations today. No one will be refused support because of their ethnicity, religion, or lack of religion, sexual orientation, gender, or if one may be a sex trade worker, or if one has serious substance abuse issues. And while Clinic has an expansive array of community health resources at 2 offices in Winnipeg, the Brandon office maintains services meeting the needs more specific to those living beyond the perimeter. Rural and northern Manitobans in a crisis situation struggle to find services and support in their small communities and experience isolation unique to their environment and can be especially at risk for suicide. Clinic Community Health in Brandon began northern and rural support services in 2000 in response to the traumatic experiences with severe and persistent flood conditions. The hotlines and online discussions are staffed with people who understand the challenges specific to rural Manitobans and respond to their needs with some context of their situation. We asked Kim Moffat, counselor and coordinator of services at Clinic Community Health in Brandon, to give us some insight to the hotline services and counseling resources available at Clinic, as well as to share with us some insight on suicide, how we might see warning signs, and how we might help prevent it.
My name's Kim Moffat, and I work here at Clinic Community Health Center in the Brandon office. And my background is actually in psychiatric nursing, graduating from the Brandon Mental Health Center School of Nursing back in the early 1990s. So I've been working in different areas of mental health over the last 25 years or so. And my position here at Clinic, I do several things. I take calls on the Manitoba Suicide Line and the Crisis Line and the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line. I also teach a crisis counseling course that people who are interested in volunteering can take. So I do that 3 months out of the year. And I also run a suicide bereavement support group.
Perhaps right now you can give me a brief overview of the clinic community health operations.
Sure. Well, like you said, Clinic is a not for profit organization. It is a community health center. We have 2 offices in Winnipeg, and we are the Brandon offsite of Clinic. So in Brandon here, our services vary differently from the ones that are offered in Winnipeg. In Brandon, we have our core service here is the Manitoba Farm and Rural Support line, and we offer telephone counseling, we offer support, counseling, information, referrals to basically anybody outside the city of Winnipeg. So if you live in Churchill and you are having some concerns or problems or issues and you want to connect with somebody, you could give us a call. We also target the population of farmers and their families because it is a unique population. So that's really our core service is the Farm and Rural Stress Line. We also do, though, partner with our clinic partners in Winnipeg in that we also share a crisis line in the Manitoba Suicide Line with them.
And Clinic has so many different programs in Winnipeg. However, we don't have the time to really go into those, but these operations do cost quite a bit, I'm sure. Where do you receive most of your core funding?
Most of our funding, our core funding for anyway, comes from Manitoba Health. So that, covers our operational expenses, that kind of thing. And in terms of our funding for doing outreach, promotion, that kind of thing, we rely heavily on donations from the public to be able to do that kind of work.
Perhaps we could talk a little bit, briefly about the history of the organization, especially the Brandon services. You've introduced the Manitoba Farm, Rural, and Northern Support Services, but was there a specific demand that led to the creation of this department?
Yeah, there sure was, Jan. Actually, back in the late 1990s, I believe, there was a lot of excess moisture happening in the northwest part of the province, and farmers and their farmland were getting heavily flooded, and it caused a lot of economic strain on farm families, of course, but also the surrounding communities. And it was at that time that many different people, women's groups, farm organizations, different politicians, were really vocal about the need for a resource for farm families to get information, to get support, to get counseling because of the enormous stress that Mother Nature can place on farmers. So it was at that point that one of the political parties that was not in power at the time said that if they were brought into power at the next election, that they would reinstate Manitoba Farm, Rural, and Northern Stress Line. So that's in fact what happened. There was actually a Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line previous to that was run in the earlier 1990s, and I believe it was run by the Canadian Mental Health Association, and it was run mainly with volunteers, and unfortunately funding was not secure, so it had a short shelf life, I guess you could say. And so fortunately now our funding is secure and we're able to have lots of different programs out of this office.
More specifically now, let's detail the crisis line services available locally. What situations can be described as crisis situations? What can one expect when calling the crisis lines? Who will they talk to? And is confidentiality something that is given with lots of trust insurance?
Yes, absolutely. Confidentiality is key. It's so important because people know that when they call here, they know that their information isn't going to be shared outside of this office. And Clinic has been around for a long time, and people have come to recognize that Clinic is a very open and safe place for people to call to talk about their problems. That it won't be be shared in the community. And so it's a safe place for people to call. In terms of what's considered a crisis, it's really different for everyone. And, what I might consider a crisis might not be, even stressful for you. So we tend not to define for people what a crisis is, but basically, a crisis is when our typical coping skills aren't working anymore for us. And so we feel overwhelmed by that. And that tends to be when people reach out for help, is when they're feeling like, gee, I've tried doing, the usual things that I try when I'm faced with difficult times, but, that's not getting me anywhere. And so it's then people will usually pick up the phone and try calling a crisis line. The people that you're going to talk to when you call a crisis line like ours are people that are paid staff who have background in counseling. And you might also speak with volunteers who have taken the clinic crisis training, which is an extensive 3-month training. And they're people that, are community folks that for one reason or another want to give back and have some time and want to help people. So, we rely really heavily on volunteers. So when you call in, you'll be speaking with someone who has lots of knowledge and training in how to help other people that are dealing with difficult times.
How do you decide what referral is best for an individual? And I imagine that ranges from everything from institutional environments to group therapy. And you also have an in-person program support group that they might fit into as well. Oh, how do you decide these things?
I mean, the first thing we do is we talk to people about their internal resources, right? So what are your strengths? What are things that you do that help you get through hard times? So we might be talking to them about, what have you done in the past that's worked? So in Brandon, there's some really great resources that people have access to if they are in crisis, and that's through the Westman Crisis Services, and they have both the mobile crisis unit and the crisis stabilization unit. So if somebody's in urgent need and they're not really sure where to go or what to do, but they know that they need to talk to somebody, they can access the mobile crisis unit, and it's simply placing a call to those folks, letting them know that you're in crisis and you're needing someone to talk to. And those folks can actually come right out to your home. They're trained professionals with backgrounds of social work or psych nurses, and they'll come to your home and they'll sit down with you and they'll talk to you about what's going on and come up with a plan for what the person thinks they need. So that may be perhaps looking at perhaps AFM would be a good referral, or maybe going to the hospital would in fact be something that they need to consider. But they can make that kind of decision in collaboration with the partner or with the client. So they're really great resources. Now, the crisis stabilization unit is another great resource if somebody's feeling that they just need to kind of step out of their life, so to speak, for a little bit because things at home have become difficult. They can access the crisis stabilization unit, and it's a short-term residential facility that is again staffed by, my understanding is they're staffed by professionals, so you can stay there for a few days or a week and get the support and the counseling that maybe you're looking for. Another resource would be, let's say you presented at the emergency room, and in consultation with the doctor that you see there, it's determined that maybe it's best, given how the person is feeling, maybe they're not feeling safe, maybe they're having thoughts of suicide, and they aren't able to come up with a safety plan for themselves, that perhaps maybe they might be admitted into the Center for Adult Psychiatry, which is another fantastic resource we have right here in Brandon.
You might have noticed that I have yet to say the word suicide, and this show is called Reduce the Stigma, and I think that in order to reduce the stigma, we must be able to mention the word suicide comfortably. So what may be some of the risk factors and protective factors that might predict suicidal thoughts in individuals in a general population? I'm thinking there might be medical or social or psychological conditions. Could we also be life changes in demographics? And other factors. Can you expand on risk factors and protective factors for me?
I think it's really important when we talk about the issue of suicide, and I understand that people really want to understand, especially after a suicide has happened, to try to figure out, what caused this, or what one thing was it that led to this person's death, and that's understandable. And I think it's really important that we view suicide as a very complex issue, and often there's multiple things that are going on in one person's life that lead to a person to make that choice to end their life. But you're right, what you were saying, there's lots of different factors that occur for people that may put them on that continuum of risk. So, certainly relationship issues, maybe somebody's suffered a job loss, a history of mental illness might increase your risk, certainly with depression. There could be a lot of different reasons. Bullying, we certainly hear from Youth Calling or using our chat program that are talking about the psychological, emotional impact that plays on you. So there's lots of different kinds of risk factors, I guess, and there's certainly different populations that may be more at risk for suicide, such as the youth, and such as elderly people. Indigenous people have a much higher suicide rate. People in our LGBTQ questioning population have a higher rate of suicide. So it requires somebody to have an understanding of populations that are at risk, and then also the risk factors that a person is presenting, to kind of put that all together and to try to figure out where is this person at in terms of risk.
Could you just give us our suicide warning signs? And it has an acronym that for us to easily remember as well. Explain that for me, please.
Sure. And this is an acronym that the Canadian Association of Suicide Prevention uses. It's a model. So it's a way of trying to more easily identify some of the symptoms or signs of someone at risk. So I stands for ideation. So is the person talking directly or indirectly about death? So indirectly, they might be saying, well, it doesn't really matter because I'm not going to make it to the wedding anyway. Or they might be more specific and saying, if my partner doesn't get back together with me, I'm just going to kill myself. So listening for those comments and then taking it seriously. I think the stats indicate that most people who do choose to end their life will put out some kind of a warning sign prior to them taking their life. So hearing those and then taking them seriously. The S stands for substance use. So for people who may be at higher risk, you might notice that they are using more alcohol, more drugs, gambling more than usual. So, that may be a sign as well. P stands for purposelessness. And for people who are thinking about suicide, it's very common for them to feel like they have lost hope, and they have a profound sense of hopelessness and helplessness, that no matter what I do, I can't seem to, get my stuff together, and nothing I do is making a difference or making me feel better. So if you're noticing that in somebody, just the sense that, they have no goals, perhaps no motivation, a lot of lethargic behavior, that may be a sign. A stands for anxiety or agitation. So you might be noticing that the person is more distressed than usual, maybe acting more nervous or anxious like. So those again, and it's none of these things in isolation mean that you're at risk for suicide, but again, it's kind of looking at the whole picture. And T stands for trapped. So, and that's a feeling that our callers will often talk about, this sense of being overwhelmed and feeling trapped, that nothing again that they can do is helping them to shake or help them move through this feeling of hopelessness. They may have had options at one point, but it's like a horse wearing blinders. And so as the options narrow, the focus becomes very narrow to the degree that at some point they only have the option in front of them, either to live with this excruciating pain or to take their life. And so we want to be in touch with people, obviously, before they've gotten to that point where they feel like they don't have very many options. The H stands for hopelessness and helplessness, and we talked about that's a very common emotion and feeling that people have. And we want people to know that there is hope, even though they may not be feeling it in that moment, that this may be part and parcel of so many people who die by suicide have been diagnosed or undiagnosed with depression, and that there are lots of different treatments out there, and there is help available, and to encourage that person not to give up hope. And the fact that they are calling us is often a very hopeful sign that they haven't made that decision. So that's something to watch for. Is your loved one experiencing those feelings? W stands for withdrawn. People will often tend to start to isolate themselves. The more they start to isolate, the more they're removed from the supports that could help them. And so that's something we want to watch for too. Are they coming home from school? Or are they just going to the room and then not kind of communicating with the family, or shutting friends off, that kind of thing? A for anger. For some folks, this certainly isn't for everybody, but some folks will exhibit signs of anger, acting out, aggression, that kind of thing. And R is for recklessness. Sometimes people who are contemplating the act of suicide just engage in reckless behavior because they feel like, well, if something happens to me, well, then, that's the way it's meant to be. Or you might see somebody who's received several speeding tickets just doing kind of reckless, dangerous things that maybe they wouldn't normally be engaged in. So that's something to watch too.
In regards to the Northern Support Services, do caller situations require counselors and referrals that might be more understanding of their rural, northern, or farm lives and lifestyles? Meaning, do your counselors have experience in those fields that they would be able to relate to those callers?
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the really important aspects, I think, and unique aspects to our service is that people who live in rural communities, farming communities, and northern communities, there's some real challenges. There's a lot of beauty to living in those areas, but there's certain challenges too that people who live in more urban centers might not experience. So because the Farm and Rural Stress Line is our core service, we wanted to really make sure that everybody who is working here and answering that specific line have strong background in farming and or rural living. So, when somebody calls, that the people who are taking those calls have a really strong understanding of what those unique challenges are and what that's like, because it's interesting, many people, and especially our farming population, when they do call in, that's one of the first things they'll ask is, can I talk to somebody who knows something about farming? And they might even ask a question to kind of test you a little bit to see, if you're the real deal.
Recently, the Cross Lake was rocked by 6 suicides, youth suicides. Could you speak to what makes youth on those reserves more vulnerable? And perhaps if one person suicides, are there a risk of followers to commit suicide?
Yeah, it's a real tragedy that's happened on that reserve. And my understanding is that, it's not uncommon for youth suicides to be happening on Indigenous reserves. And I think I'm certainly no expert, but my understanding is, from what I've heard and what I've read and what people tell me on the phone line, is that for youth, it's often a lack of opportunity, lack of resources, having something purposeful or meaning to do, and it is also that sense of isolation, not living quite a ways away from an urban center where there's lots of opportunities for youth to get involved in organized sports and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of different issues that are happening for them, not even to mention the residual effect of colonization in the residential school system and the impacts, the trickle down impacts that has had on them. Perhaps their mothers or fathers or aunties or uncles or grandparents, or maybe all of them, have been impacted by the residential school system. And so knowing about, the different impacts that can have on people and their ability to parent, it makes sense to me that youth are also, impacted by that directly and indirectly. I think it's, as individuals and as communities and our governments, we all need to take a serious look about how can we get to the root causes of this? How can we support the youth because six suicides in any community is an enormous number, but a community that size and within that short of time is very, very concerning. And there's a lot that needs to be done, and I'm hopeful that this has come to light, that there are some supports and people taking a serious look at what can we do to prevent this from happening again. And so if I could just put a plug in for our service, one of the programs that youth are really connecting with is our chat program. A lot of times youth aren't comfortable calling and talking to a counselor. That might feel scary. We have a program where kids can get on their computers or on their phone and they can chat with a counselor in real time, and it's a way that kids, I think, feel safe and log on and speak with a counselor and get what they need, and maybe we'll make some referrals, or maybe that would just be enough, just that little connection, just having somebody to talk to in a moment of darkness. It's a great opportunity for youth to be able to reach out in a safe and anonymous way, and it doesn't cost them any monies. And if people want to connect to us on the chat program, they can just simply go to www.ruralsupport.ca and click on the chat program. It's that easy.
How does Clinic Community Health promote their services in order for people to know that they are available? And are there specific challenges in reaching those that need help?
Well, promotion's always something that we're working hard at, and of course, promotion takes a lot of money, and so we rely on social media a lot. We have lots of paper promotional products that we distribute around the province in health units and hospitals. So I mean, it's an ongoing, I guess, part of our job. I guess you could say it is a little bit of a challenge, making sure that we are always out there and visible so that people know that we are available to them. We have a really great website, actually a few websites, www.reasontolive.ca, and there's lots of good information on there, especially for people who are feeling hopeless, feeling helpless. It's full of information and resources, videos, things like that people can watch.
You have mentioned in a previous interview, in a previous chat, we're a little bit more difficult or reticent to seek help. Could you expand on that?
I think in the past we've done a bit of a disservice to men in that we perhaps haven't raised them in a way that has made it okay and safe for them to talk about their feelings and their emotions, and men being socialized that way. Of course, when it comes time to dealing with big problems, sometimes find it difficult to be able to talk about their feelings, and we want to make it okay and safe for men to do that because we all share the same emotions, men and women and transgendered folks. It's just whether or not society allows certain populations to express them. And so I think it is improving. I think men are starting to see the value in connecting with their emotions, and sometimes it takes a crisis for that to happen, but we want to be sensitive to that fact too. And so when a man is calling and they're a little bit uncertain about where to start, we just say, you start wherever you'd like to start, and acknowledge that it's a hard thing to do, to call a crisis line, but that it's a really good, healthy first step in working through their problems. So we give them lots of praise for doing that kind of important work.
Does social stigma work against individual efforts to seek help? Maybe it's social shame. Maybe one may be less likely to admit they need help sometimes. I think men again. Does stigma reduce the efficacy of suicide prevention in other ways?
Stigma can sometimes be just as difficult or even more devastating than living with a particular illness itself. At least that's what folks have told me. So I think it's so important that we keep talking about mental health, the importance of good mental health, and the importance of getting help if your mental health is languishing and perhaps maybe have a mental illness. So I think there's a lot of positive movement towards improving society's comfort, I guess, in talking about one's mental health. I think there's still a long way to go, but I think initiatives like Bell Let's Talk movement has been a very positive thing. And I see lots of different, grassroots initiatives taking place that are trying to raise awareness about the importance of recognizing good mental health. And so I think that's really, really hopeful, very optimistic. But unfortunately, the stigma still prevents a lot of people from reaching out to get help. I read a stat just recently that indicated that 60% of Canadians don't reach out for help, but may have a diagnosable mental illness. So I think it's really important to, keep talking about it in interviews like this, just, trying to take the stigma away from it. We quite often, will talk openly about physical health issues that we may have. And so my wish is that we can someday just have conversations about our mental health just as openly. And it starts with all of us, even mental health professionals, sharing, if you're comfortable, any kind of issues or concerns we have, because we are no different from the rest of the population. We have struggles. We may live with anxiety, with depression. And so if we can be comfortable talking about that, I think it gives people permission. Or, if somebody who is maybe seen as a mentor in the community, if they can talk openly about their own struggles with mental illness, well, then, if that person can do it, maybe I can do it too. And so I think we're heading in the right direction. I'm hopeful anyway.
Clinic Community Health also runs suicide bereavement counseling. Can you please expand upon the help provided there, and how does stigma affect the survivors of a suicidal death?
We have a wonderful group right here that runs out of our office, that for people whose lives have been unfortunately impacted by the death of a loved one or a friend, or it could be even a coworker. We have people that travel 3 or 4 hours out of Brandon to come to this group because there isn't a lot of support out there for this kind of unique need. So it's extremely important to have a place where people feel safe, that they can talk about the often devastating impacts that a family is left with after a death by suicide. It's a place where we can kind of normalize, validate people's feelings. They can talk about their loved ones. And there's so many questions that people grapple with after a death. And sometimes people will find an answer, but most often they're left with more questions. And you can imagine that, that can kind of be crazy making if you're constantly trying to figure out or piece together what went wrong with your loved one. And so we support people in the place they're at. There's no right or wrong way to grieve a death by suicide. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of support, but there's definitely still a lot of stigma out there. And I think that's why people find this group so important, is that they can come and they can talk about their loved one, they can say their name, they can not only talk about the challenges that their loved one faced, but also the beautiful and memorable things about their loved one. And so we're both mourning and celebrating their loved one at the same time sometimes. But people who come to the group definitely talk about the shame and stigma they feel in their communities. And different ones will have said to me that following the death of a loved one, people will cross the street ahead of them so they don't have to come face to face and talk to them, and the hurt that causes people, because they really do need that support and understanding in order to grieve their loved one.
What should people do if they know someone who's expressing ideation or suicidal thoughts?
I think it's important to be brave. It's a scary topic, when somebody says they're thinking about suicide. But I think it's also important to have the courage to act on that, right? And so if somebody says to you that they've been feeling this way, they've chosen you for a reason. So maybe they felt safe sharing that secret with you. And so I guess I would encourage people not to keep that a secret, even though the person says, please don't tell anyone that I'm feeling this way. Suicide is a secret that we don't want to keep, because that can have devastating consequences. So be bold, be brave. If you can, ask the person if they are thinking about it seriously, if they have a plan, and there's lots of other kinds of questions that you can ask. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable, and don't know what to ask, and that's okay. There's lots of people out there who are comfortable in asking those difficult difficult questions. And so if the answer to your original question is, yeah, I am thinking about suicide, you don't have to be the expert. You can ask them what they need. You can take them to a safe place like the local emergency room or local hospital, or sit with them as they make an appointment to speak with a mental health worker. Being present for somebody when they're sharing the secret can often go a long way. And I guess depending on the urgency of the situation, if that person's feeling like they are at immediate risk, then most definitely take them to the local hospital to get them some immediate support.
What should people know about suicide in terms of common misconceptions? I'm trying to dispel some myth or rumor. For example, maybe that a person who suicides is weak when we know that they've probably been very strong up to this point. So, is there any other misconceptions that we can hopefully dispel with this question?
Sure. I think language is really important when we talk about suicide. I think we need to be mindful about how we talk about the issue of suicide. We still hear a lot today people using the term commit suicide as opposed to die by suicide. And the change in language really came from the survivors movement. And up until 1970, I believe, dying by suicide or attempting suicide was actually a criminal offense. And so when we hear the word commit, we often think of something that's illegal or criminal. You commit a crime. But suicide and the act of suicide is not a crime. And so if we can move away from using that language, I think, the survivors are saying that is a difficult enough issue to deal with, but when it's continually referred to as commit, it's hard to hear that language. You will often hear people say, well, that person had a failed suicide attempt or a successful suicide attempt. And again, we want to be mindful not to use those terms because there's nothing successful about an attempt or a completion. And a failed suicide attempt, we don't want to even further add to somebody's sense of failure, because often when somebody is thinking about suicide, they feel like they have failed at many things. So just being mindful of our language is really important as well. Some people think, well, if someone is saying they're going to kill themselves or alluding to their own death, that they're not actually going to follow through with it, that, maybe they're just wanting attention. We hear that a lot, especially with young people. Oh, that's just so and so, and she's always looking for attention. And yeah, they are looking for attention, and it's important that we give them that attention. People are hurting, and they're saying these things because they do want somebody to recognize that they are struggling. So it's important that we take any threat, whether it's direct or indirect, seriously, and explore with that person, what's going on.
Volunteer training. It's essential to clinic operations. How many volunteers do you have? Do they all work phone lines? What kind of training do they receive, and what kind of benefits do they receive? Experience, references, anything else?
Sure. We love our volunteers here at Clinic, and Clinic couldn't run without the great work that volunteers do side by side with us. In the Brandon office, we have anywhere between 15 and 20 volunteers at any one time. In Clinic, they have a lot more programs, and they have about 200 volunteers at any one time. So the volunteers in the Brandon office, they assist us, work side by side with us in taking calls, and they do so after they've completed a 3-month, quite intensive training to learn how to be crisis volunteers. So we meet twice a week on a Tuesday and Thursday evening for 3.5 hours, and the issues that they learn are quite varied. Obviously, they're going to take a couple of classes on counseling skills and effective, therapeutic communication, that kind of thing. But then we look more specifically at some of the issues that are reflective of the kinds of calls we get on the line. So domestic violence, suicide, we spend a couple of evenings talking about that, children at risk, mental illness, addictions, those kinds of issues.
So you mentioned a few campaigns such as Bell Let's Talk and Reason to Live. I was wondering, along that same theme, what groups, gatherings, or events do you know of or participate in that focuses on suicide prevention? Are there awareness campaigns that we could be aware of?
Yeah, one that comes to mind right away is SPIN, which stands for Suicide Prevention Implementation Network. And they are a very, very active and engaged committee that meets once a month in Brandon here. And people on that committee come from all different kinds of organizations, from corrections to school division, family services, selves, all kinds of community members. There's quite an extensive membership. And they're all meeting to work towards having a suicide safer community. So they do a lot of great work in this community in terms of public education, hosting events, that kind of thing. So they're always busy planning something. There's also World Suicide Prevention Day that happens every year in September, and there is an event that happens in our community every year. It usually takes place at the Prairie Oasis venue, and it's just to bring awareness, to the importance of suicide prevention. There's a lot of promotion around the event and education, so that happens every year. Something that I've just recently started participating in is the Andrew Dunn Walk, and that takes place in Souris. This is the second year that Souris has hosted such an event. It has been happening in Oakbank over several years, but a couple from Souris who lost their son to suicide has now taken it upon themselves to host this event. And so it's a beautiful event happening on Saturday, May 7th in Souris. And so it's, again, to raise awareness, the importance of suicide prevention. And so there'll be lots of displays and information there. It's a nice way to honor those who have died by suicide, but also to prevent further suicides. Internationally, there is an annual event put on by the Canadian Association of Suicide Prevention, or CASP, and that event happens every year, and it attracts people who are survivors, people who are in the helping business, I guess you'd call it, clinicians, researchers. So it's bringing best practices of what's working and sharing that information so that people are getting, the best information possible about how to help people in need. We also have a Circle of Remembrance event that is happening in June. I don't have the date for that yet, but it is an event that happens up at the Riverbank Discovery, and it's a beautiful memorial service for people who have lost someone to suicide, and it's a nice way for people to come and reflect and to commemorate their loved one.
I guess just as one more piece of information that we should surely require, and that is your phone numbers and contact information.
If you or anyone you know are at risk for suicide or having suicide ideation and would like to speak with someone, you can call the Manitoba Suicide Line. It's a toll-free number. It's 1-877-435-7170. If you are in crisis and again you would like to speak with somebody, the toll-free number for that line is 1-888-322-3019. And the number for the Manitoba Farm Rural and Northern Support Services is 1-867-367-3276. And the phone number for the Manitoba Farm Rural and Northern Support Services is 1-866-367-3276.
That was Kim Moffat, Counselor and Coordinator of Services at Clinic Community Health in Brandon, Manitoba. If someone you know has suicidal thoughts or is in a crisis situation, please take their condition seriously. While almost everybody at some point wonders what it would be like to take their own life, serious contemplation of suicide suggests at the very least an underlying condition. Most people in crisis can be helped, and there is help. Please look further into the resources you might have that can benefit you in a time of crisis. My name is Jan Eck. Thank you for listening to Reduce the Stigma. I hope you found this episode informative and helpful, and I wish you the best of mental health.
You are listening to Reduce the Stigma, CJ106 docu-series funded by Community Radio Fund of Canada, narrated by Jan Eck, produced by Jan Eck, Matthew